come to Art 7, and we're looking at how visioning experience into art happens. It is one of the most sophisticated processes that we are capable of. When we live in healthy experience, our experience flows with nature. And they flow so closely that the traditional saying is that we participate with nature. Whatever nature is doing, our experience is doing that as well. And all cultures on the planet sought to calibrate what they did at any time, every day, throughout the year, so that experience would be kept in sync with nature, so that one lived naturally. And that no matter what would occur, nature always goes on from there, and one could survive anything. Even as there were storms in nature, there would be storms in life, in experience, but they would pass and a new day would come. Or a night of healing would come. Or there would be festivals or ceremonies at times during the ritual year where the healing of the entire community would take place to re-participate with nature in its way. In the center of North America, for about 10,000 years, the height of the sun, the summer solstice, was always celebrated. And it was the axial core of the ritual year. And one of the qualities that was there for the sun dance in all the Plains Indians, the Algonquin name for it is Okan. It had two participants that were extremely important. It had a holy woman and it had a courageous young man. And the holy woman would be old enough to be like the grandmother, and the young man young enough to be the grandson. And their relationship was a primordial parenthesis around the health of natural experience. That there's something in the grandmothering or grandfathering, the three generations, and taking the first and third together and making sure that you have this grandmother or grandfather effect. The grandfathering was always an individual transform visioning. One would go on a vision quest and it would be a grandfathering energy that would come to you with visions. But in the community, it was the grandmothering that was the important source of the visions. When you're there as a individual seeking to discover your spiritual person, that grandfathering is a very important relationship. It's that you're being re-fathered, not by another father, but by your father's father. Even in metaphor. A man old enough to have been your father's father, and he now is re-fathering you to give you a personal vision. But the communal vision was always a grandmother quality. She ensured, and in the Okan, in the sun dance, the holy woman, the grandfather of that ritual, of that tribe, Other tribes could be invited if they didn't have someone who could put on a Sundance that year. They were welcome. That holy woman would have gone out in midwinter and made an oath to the land in the form of a prayer, in the form of making a kind of prayer vehicle, something to carry the prayer, carry the voice. A scarf sometimes, maybe tied with some herbs or some stones or some feathers. And she would leave it out in midwinter in the cold, snowy wind. And this would be her mark that she would sponsor in the summer a Sundance. And she would be the holy woman who would be the grandmother for the entire tribe on that occasion. And her holiness was bestowed in several interesting, resonant ways. She would keep from the time that she made the prayer to sponsor and to shepherd as a grandmother this Sundance, she would keep a vigil in herself on the whole tribe. And she would bring herself closer and closer to the Sundance time, the summer solstice time, where she would be able to keep in her attentiveness every single person in the tribe as a community. So that when she went into the first day of an 8-day Sundance, she would go into a teepee outside of the circle of the teepees of the tribe. And she would remain in there, praying and keeping every individual in her visionary blessing and weave them into the whole. And while she did so, each day she would take dried buffalo tongues and cut them into like fajita slivers, so that at a certain moment in the Sundance, where the courage of the young man had to exemplify almost a life-threatening quality, when that was successful, she would then come out and distribute the fajited dried buffalo tongues to everyone in the tribe, a kind of a Paleolithic communion. And this was her feeding everyone of the tongue of the buffalo, because the buffalo was the synthesizing center of the natural culture, of the participation of their experience in nature. And what she took of the buffalo was the tongue, the ability to speak. And so what she was bestowing was a very sacred convocation that the entire community, the entire tribe, would be able to speak the language of the buffalo, be able to live in such a way that they folded into nature with the buffalo as the central synthesizing core of it. When the United States began to finally print its money, the buffalo was on the nickel, and the other side was an American Indian chief head. And it was a form of this kind of a blessing. That young man had to ensure through his courage a central pole was put, which was the fork of a tree that had been cut down by all of the men who had ever fought in battles in war. Only those who have fought in war were allowed to go on that party, to go out and find that tree in the forest. In the plains, there are not huge forests, but like copses, groves, and they would go and they would find through an old man what was the right tree, and then the men would sit around that tree and tell that tree true stories of their bravery in battle. And when the men had finished telling that tree that they were worthy to take that tree's life for a sacred ceremony, that they were pledging their own courage to bona fide this, that tree was cut down and trimmed of all of its branches except a big fork, sometimes a triple fork, usually a pair of prongs, cut, snubbed, and they would bring it back in a wagon singing victory songs back into the center of the circle of teepees. And they would then erect in a great huge rush of all the men of the tribe, half of them pulling on ropes, half of them with long poles, to raise this Sundance Lodge center. And then anyone who had a prayer, a beseeching prayer, a blessing prayer, these prayers were then tied to the ends of these poles, and they were put in collection into the notch of that Sundance pole, so that the center of the Sundance Lodge was a particular quality. Have them come in. Then all of the circumference of that Sundance Lodge would be woven with willow wattling and then stuffed with evergreens. And that young man, to prove his courage, not just his courage, but to prove the courage of the people, that he was the exemplar, he was the courageous heart of the tribe at that moment in that place. 2 long rawhide thongs were drawn down from the top of the Sundance pole where all the prayers were, and he was skewered with the other ends that were tied into antlers, and the antlers were put into his flesh about where the shoulder comes in. And he would have to, in a do or die dance, pull himself free, or to pull out 2 patches of flesh from his body. He had to free himself from that double line. If he cried out with a human voice, everything would be finished and it would be a failure. So he was given one of the bones from the inner wing of an eagle, which makes a natural whistle. And he was allowed to have this eagle bone whistle in his mouth. And the only thing that he could do was to allow his heavy breathing to make a natural whistle sound, which sounds eerily like eagle hunting, pouncing. And so one would hear, in the midst of this enormous sudden silence, not his breathing, but one would hear the shrill call of a hunting eagle. And when he pulled free is when the holy woman would reemerge and distribute the dried buffalo tongues to the people. This was a consecration. Now, ritual ceremonies that have symbols can produce vision. They can ensure that one elicits a vision. If you're on a vision quest, you can have it individually. Or if you're in a ceremony like the Okan, the community can have it as well. But what is not brought forth is art. Nor is the spirit person brought forth. just the vision. So in the natural realm, the best that our kind could have done was from time to time to have visions and to have natural life, natural experience, and to have powerful symbols that held it all together, and to have rituals that would distribute it so that it would have a structure in our existence and in our actions, in the way that we live. And that was a great wheel of the way things were, which had a center. And generally in the natural, cultural realm, the center is one's soul. But when art comes into play, art emerges out of a transform of experience which is supernatural. Just as experience can participate with nature so that the two processes flow together, one can get used to, in a very special way, to have one's experience participate with vision constantly, so that one now doesn't have experience that is natural so much as that it has experience that is visionary. And if one is living in such a way that one's experience is visionary, what comes out of it are not rituals, but art. And so the symbols turn around, and instead of being integral and holding together the rituals, they become jewel-like and they radiate out possibilities, and they're like a lens that opens up the whole realm of spiritual possibility. So that works of art are not antithetical to rituals, but that they are a completely different mode and different kind. And they can be brought together, but the only place that they really come together is in the symbolic mind. That in a way, symbols mediate between rituals and art. And while when art comes into play, ritual goes out of play. If rituals become dominant and keep in play, art can't come into play. And so the tension is not on the rituals and not on the art, but the tension is in the mind, on the symbols. And so one of the biggest concerns in maturation for our kind is to make sure that we have the ability to have an equanimous mind, a balanced mind, but not a mind that is hesitant and in limbo. Because the hesitant, neutral mind, the abstractly neutral or the limbo hesitant mind, is indecisive, cannot do either, cannot make up its mind. And this is a true confusion. It's one of the only places in the universe where true confusion happens. Randomness is everywhere in the universe, and it is totally natural. But the confusion in the mind shows, especially in the eyes, and not just in the eyes, but in a very special way in the pupils of the eyes. When Black Elk wrote his great, through dictation, his great visions, Black Elk Speaks, he said that he noticed that white men very frequently got lost in the dark of their eyes. One of the great early Chinese painters, Kukai-Chi, lived about 1,600 years ago. When he would do portraits of people, he would put them aside before he finished the pupils for several weeks, sometimes a couple of months. And he was asked once, why do you do this? And he said, well, you can paint the likeness of someone as they physically are there, as one would see, yes, this is how they look, but the pupils in the eyes look back out. And one has to be very attentive that the pupils in a painting, in a portrait, look back out. That the work of art is alive in itself and is not just a reproduction. It's not just representing something that's alive out there. It is itself now spiritually alive here in its own right. There was a very powerful emperor who had a cataract condition, and he did not want to have Kukaichi paint his portrait because he didn't want to have this registered. And Kukaichi said, well, I will paint your portrait, and when I put the pupils in later, I will put the image of a haze in the distance in the pupils, so that someone looking at it will look to see that you are looking at a landscape scroll and not that you are partially blind. And the emperor understood. Because the landscape scroll tradition in East Asian art was a way of taking the nature that's out there, where one's experience can participate in that, to have a supernatural art nature, and one's experience can participate in that. So one found a tradition that developed. The first time that there was anyone who really wrote about this and did this in a big way was Kukaichi. He died about 400 AD and was extremely famous in his day for this. One of the sayings in ancient Taoism is that you can always tell a Taoist master because their pupils, the pupils of their eyes, are square. Which means that when they look to see in a compositional way. We call that in our education, in our learning, the square of attention. It's not just that it's square, but that it is symmetrical and balanced in such a way that it composes. That eye, when looking now, can look naturally and perceive, and can look integrally and conceive, but can also look compositionally and create. So that one of the qualities of a creative artist is that everything that they do now is a transform out of ritual into art. And that one of the qualities that shows this is the ability to make a landscape painting. And so the mark of a really fine, deep gentleman in China was that he was able to take some friends, sit down with some plum wine, a nice moonlit night, some flowers, and unveil one of his prize scrolls, Chinese landscape scrolls. And they would spend the evening traveling in it together, and then from time to time writing a poem together. Each one would write a couple of lines, and in this way the men would understand that it wasn't just that some genius could do this, but that all men who took the trouble to be prepared and cultivate themselves could eventually form a group or a community of men who were able to do this together, that they could travel together into this further realm. And so one had the development in China, a very interesting piece of furniture. It's called the scholar's table. It's like a very simple desk with usually just a single drawer, 3 drawers in a single row. And that desk would have on it a jar, sometimes out of bamboo, sometimes carved out of wood, sometimes made out of ceramic. And that jar would hold all of his brushes. And next to it would be a plate with indentations where one could mix one's ink. And the ink would come in a block, and you would take water and you would mix your ink in various ways, various thicknesses, and then you would have a supply of handmade paper. And on that paper, one would practice language, your calligraphy, then painting. After you put in between language and the painting, the transform, which would be the poetry. So one of the signs that you are able now to make art is that you have acquired the ability to use language poetically. The calligraphic language are the symbolic characters of the spoken language. And one can have just standard calligraphy. But as soon as your ability to transform into a poetic would be there, the calligraphy would be the first thing to show it. It would start to become stylized. It would be your personal, spiritual hand that's writing this. So that now calligraphy, while it could be just documentary, symbolic writing, has the ability to be the beginnings of personal art. And that's why in China, Japan, when someone really wanted to know who this was, they would look at your calligraphy, at the style of your calligraphy. And then, once one had the ability to have a calligraphic style, you would be able to apply so that you would write in that calligraphic style your own poems. And so, sharing your poems in your calligraphic style was put into the landscape scroll, usually put on the left and the top. And so the landscape scrolls would have the record of the calligraphy, the poetry, and the painting all together. So that the men sitting around with their plum wine together in a moonlit evening would have these layers of appreciation. And as they began to appreciate together, the quality of their shared poem together would emerge and increase. And one way, metaphorically, to talk about this is that they were all getting very pleasantly drunk. But they were getting drunk in the sense that they were inebriated on transformation. They were entering into a realm where the water has become wine, where the language of ritual and culture has now fermented itself and is emerging as a beautiful spoken plum wine, and that the men shared this together. And so there was a quality of masculine camaraderie that was similar to the camaraderie of valor in battle. This was the valor of facing the limitations of the mind, because only a mind that can let go can transform. Only a mind that can agree that it's not going to be the boss anymore, but it's going to be a participant in a larger ecology of meaning. And while this is something that comes in its own special way to women, it comes as a very difficult task for men. That men have a very tough time doing this. And so one found in the East Asia tradition, after about 1,000 years, where mainly it was developed in China, there were a few people in Japan trying to do this, and then all of a sudden, about 1,000 years after Kukai-chi, one of the greatest art geniuses of all time, like a Zen Rembrandt, matured, and his name was Sesshu. This is a portrait of Sesshu at 71. He lived to be 86. 1420 to 1506. Sesshu means snow boat. he took himself to China when he was 48. And when he went to China, the Chinese were startled because they said, "You're coming to us as a student? You're better than anybody here. No one can touch you." And so when Sesshu came back to Japan after a while, he became the focus of a kind of deep mystery because he was like the magician become artist. He was like a super magician who could make works of art that were alive. He could create spiritual life in his paintings, in his portraits, but especially in his landscapes. And in 1910, under imperial authority in Japan, this monograph on Sesshu was published, and I will show you two sections of most remarkable work. And I'll tell you about it in a minute. Here's one of the sections by Sesshu. This was done about 500 years ago, and this is the second section. When he was about 80, he prepared himself, and he got all of his brushes and all of his inks mixed, and in one day, he did a 60-foot landscape scroll, which this is a reproduction of. And it has always been held to be one of the greatest works of art in the world. One can't even compare the Sistine Chapel to it. It is impossible to think of someone so comprehensive at instant composition without end through an entire day, like having the brilliance of a super insight that you extend for the entire day and keep it so that it expresses itself, and that the landscape scroll now has become a whole mountain range in itself, not just a scroll of an angle of vision of mountain range, but the scroll itself is immense and has become a harbinger that there is now something new that is capable in human beings. Not only can we do works of art, but literally some now are great enough to be able to create whole new worlds, whole new realms, whole new artscapes, that as one now would journey in something like the long scroll, you would have an expansion many times over of the power of a landscape scroll that's vertical, or of a portrait, or of any kind of limited work. And so it became a challenge, especially in Japan, to try to find some way to better Sesshu, to overdo or outdo, to expand beyond it. And one of the earliest attempts was from an artistic genius named Hokusai, who decided that he would take the central synthesizing landscape symbol of Japan, Mount Fuji, and he would do 100 views or 36 views. He would make these composite books of these views of Mount Fuji. But it still was like just a collection of different angles. It wasn't until Hiroshige that Japan had an artist as great as Sesshu, and who was able to expand the long scroll. And in his 55 prints of the Tokaido, one has something that's about 5 times the size of Sesshu's long scroll. But what's interesting about it is that you could take any given print of the Tokaido. This is number 26 out of the Tokaido. You have a glare? And you could look at it as a work of art in and of itself. And yet, when you put all 55 prints of the Tokaido together, in a long scroll, the scroll does not register itself on a single sheet of paper, but registers itself in a larger field of your consciousness where the memory remembers the others in their order. And so the symbolic integral, the visionary creative imagination and remembering now lends through the person and produced something called historical consciousness. And while it's there nascently in something like Sesha's long scroll, in Hiroshige's Tokaido print, for the first time, one saw the ability of the artistic spiritual person to emerge a new power of historical consciousness. So that one not only had the sense of history as a chronology or history as a record, one now had the ability to have an expanded super expansion of consciousness out of vision into historical consciousness, where it was not mediated by the symbolic mind, but was founded on the symbolic mind and mediated by the artistic person. And so about 1834, 1835, in Japan, historical consciousness in the art of Hiroshige became a startling new facility. In Europe, at the same time, working, struggling to try to find a way to transform what he called at that time the phenomenology of the mind into the phenomenology of the spirit, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, named Hegel, wrote his great works that showed that when there is a supra-personal, spiritual, conscious, historical energy, it moves in such a way that what is created out of its process is the cosmos. And instead of having just a universe that's all together, one now has a cosmic outlook that is infinitely possible forever. And so between Hiroshige and Hegel, one had at the very same time this powerful spur that history was no longer just the record of something past, but was a super-artistic creative process. And that what would come out of that process, the forms that would come out of it, would be real science, real knowing. Not just experiment with ritual, not just experiments with symbolic understanding, but would be actual developments. And so the development of science from about the 1830s into our own time has been phenomenal because of the development of historical consciousness. Let's take a little break. Let's come back to Hiroshige. Let's come back to this print from the Tokaido series. If you notice, the swoop of the trail as it goes up is paralleled by the same swoop on the slope of Mount Fuji way in the background, that blue peak. The composing eye. When an artist is able to immerse his experience in his vision and looks with the creative imagination flowing with conscious remembering, he can bring experience through the symbolic mind so comprehensively and so fast that it produces an indelible imagery and remembering to almost any degree of exactness that one would like to have. I have several times told of one time up above Lake Tahoe, where the Heavenly Valley ski area was, of going into a deep, strong samadhi about 30 years ago to check something out in myself, and of throwing a knapsack off my shoulder and a little can of juice tumbled out and the sun glinted off the top of the can of juice. And when I went into that deep, powered samadhi, floating up in my mind's eye was a little oval that had in blue script, sun-kissed. Out of a glint of sunlight, you can resolve the word. Not just looking at the sunlight, but out of the corner of your eye. But a really great creative artist doesn't just resolve the detail of the image, but is able to compose in a creative field so that all of the different aspects of his work can occur to him in something stronger than a gestalt in a composition. We know from his own report that Mozart was loath to write anything down until he heard the entire piece of music in his mind, in his creative mind. And then he would furiously just write it down just to transcribe it. But he would have heard the piece of music in his mind in such a way that the time limitation of it was obviated by the jewel-like scintillation of his artistic person. He could lens something that might take 40 minutes in time so that he could hear it all together and then take the time to transcribe it. Frank Lloyd Wright was this kind of great artist. And one of the most startling, well-testified buildings that he designed, the most famous house of the 20th century in the world. He was asked to design it and build it, and he didn't put anything down on paper, and months went by, and more months went by. And then at his Taliesin home in Wisconsin, he got a phone call that the client was in Milwaukee and would be in Spring Green, Wisconsin in about an hour and a half. Was driving there and liked to see the plans. And all of the young architects that were studying under Wright were absolutely nervous and dumbfounded that their teacher, their master, was going to fail one of the biggest commissions of his whole life. And 4 of them, headed by Wesley Peters and a couple of other very famous writers on Wright, later said that he sat down with his beautiful suit on, his tie, arranged a flower on his desk and his drafting table, and took out his drafting pens and colored paper, and in about 1 hour he laid out the entire house perfectly, so that just as the client, Edgar Kaufman, came in the door, Wright got up and said, "Glad to see you, Mr. Kaufman. Right over here, we have your house all laid out for you." Wright's own house, Taliesin, which he rebuilt a couple of times, is a monumental expansion of Hiroshige, who is a monumental expansion of Sesshu, who is a monumental expansion of the Chinese landscape tradition. And there are aspects to Taliesin where you get the interior. He first built it in 1911. That there is a kaleidoscopic quality to all the facets But what is interesting and characteristic of a right building is that when you go into it, if you give your awareness over to the kinesthetic, natural experience that you will be having, that experience all by itself will open up and transform into a conscious experience where you sense, not in the geometry of the symbolic mind, but in the kinesthetics now, that the natural awareness has been transformed into an artistic kinesthetic. And that as you move through the right house more and more, the atmosphere of the house will tune your kinesthetic apprehension and apprehensiveness to the house. And you will experience very quick telescoping of whatever it was that you were experiencing before, thinking about or worried about, and you will come into the calm of the building. Not the calm in the sense of a limbo, but the calm in the tone that the kinesthetic of the building is that all the resonances are ordered, all of them. And that your experience in that house, in that building, becomes ordered. Now you can go out from such a structure and you can carry with you that kinesis. And not just right, but any really great architecture will be able to do this for you. One of the projects I had for myself a long time ago, 25 years ago, was to go over to Pasadena and make a slide show for myself of the Gamble House, built by Green and Green in 1902 for the owners of Procter & Gamble soap. And the Green brothers told the Gambles, why don't you go to Europe for a year, and when you come back, the house will be ready. And they spent about $50,000, which in 1900 was like about $2 million. And they built this fabulous house, and the whole house has all of the resonances of it, handled together by a Japanese symbolic motif of the cloud, where you will have a line, and then you will have a little bit of a squashed bubble in the middle, and the line will continue. And so this cloud motif is all through the entire house. Every time you can sense a detail, there it is again, over and over again in many variations. The back of a chair will have it. Over the fireplace, the beautiful tile brick will have it. And when you go to the third story, which is the attic, the whole house is held together by one massive beam that's in a cloud-like thing. And then you realize that there are no nails in the house anywhere. Everything is joined together and doweled and dovetailed so that the house is built like a ship would be built. There are no nails anywhere. And that the entire composition has the harmonic of the cloud, not just the cloud motif, but the cloud kinesis. And after about 5 or 6 hours in the Gamble house, I remember walking out and walking to my car, and I felt like I was scuffing clouds with my feet. Because the kinesis, because of paying attention to it artistically in deep intent, for about 5 hours without break, had produced this quality, which carried around for quite a long time afterwards. And one can recall that and bring that back into play. That dimension, it's called sometimes in one of the great American poems, Wallace Stevens called it an amphitheatrical space. That space is no longer just a distance, but it becomes an amphitheater wherein you're aware that you are moving in a real enormous drama, which is a heartful spiritual life. And that this building or this work of art has been like a lens that is disclosed to you that you can not only see in this way, you can be in this way. And so works of art give us again and again ways to go into expansions beyond just the mind indexing something in an integral. The mind is very powerful and rightly respected, but its strongest integral, which is the idea of itself as an individual centered, is actually like a speck compared to the amphitheater of the spiritual person. And one realizes, well, I'm at this hour, on this day, in this town, in this place right now, but my life is billions of years in an amphitheater of galaxies without end, and all of that kinesis is here now. And so art has a scintillating vitality that is startling. So much so that initially one doesn't realize the scale. It's like somebody being shown something that is so bright that they only see the flash at first, and they're not able to really acclimate, because you have to be prepared for a long time to acclimate. And what you're acclimating to is not a new condition, but a resonance that expands the conditionless into a kinetic awareness, which is a superconsciousness. The house that he designed for Edgar Kaufman is called Falling Water, and it is one of the most famous houses in the world, and it is built alongside of a waterfall, and you can see that Falling Water is situated such that the building now performs in a landscape transform like in the East Asia tradition 1,500 years ago. The spiritual person was that way. Now the house, the building, is an expansion of the spiritual person. So that one has not only expanded sets of resonance, but that the harmonic now has gained an amphitheatrical amperage and extent, that something new comes into view, and that is that the spiritual person has a resonant relationship to the cosmos as a whole. We are not just here. We have always been here. We don't just fit. We live here. We belong, even more than the rocks belong, to reality. 1,600 years ago, the first great Chinese landscape painter, Kukai-Chi, wrote a mystical poem, and I'll just read you a few lines in translation, called On Thunder and Lightning. The startle of the explosive expansiveness of being able to take the magic of visionary consciousness and putting it into the high magic of art. Sound and light, whence or whither, boom, blast, roll away, flash, burst, vanish. When the vast gloom of winter fades to yields its place to young spring, as hibernating lives to new birth awake, these impelling spirits are the first aroused and respond. So you can see this seething quality, and towards the end of the 400s in China, there was a famous philosophic aesthetic genius named Xia Ho, and he wrote a little treatise called The Six Techniques of Painting, and he numbered them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but the first one has always been one of the hallmarks of East Asian art. In Chinese, it's pronounced, it's just 4 characters, Qi Yun Sheng Tong. And qi or qi is like the qi energy. Originally, qi in Chinese, qi, the character meant the steam from cooking rice. It's an indication that nourishment is on its way. That nourishing energy, that steam, that nourishing steam, fragrant energy, qi. Qi Yung, translated, has a lot of different ways to say it, but the best way to say it is resonant spirit or resonance spirit. And the other two characters, Sheng Tong, mean something like life movement or movement of vitality. And as soon as that spirit resonance is present, it has the amperage of vitality so that whatever happens develops a kinesis. It doesn't just move existentially, it doesn't just relate symbolically, but it generates vitally. And so the spirit is vital. The spirit is life. And one now realizes that it isn't just your body and your mind, but your life has an actual presence as a vitality, and that art is all about the forms that express this. So that works of art have this startling vitality to them. When Frank Lloyd Wright was designing Falling Water, at the same time he was given a commission in Racine, Wisconsin, by the founders of Johnson & Johnson, baby products and things like that. And the Johnson Company wanted to build a new headquarters. And in 1936, Wright was building like this. This is an interior space done 2/3 of a century ago. It's the first time anyone ever used glass tubes as walls. And you can see the quality of light here. The light in the building has a particular plant leaf glow. You may not have ever had the chance. It has the tone, quality of sunlight coming through summer dogwood leaves. And underneath them, if you're really attentive, you see that the light there is slightly greenish. It is greenish in a peculiar way in that the sunlight, which has all the colors of the spectrum, when it comes through with that green, the undertone of the green is gold. Sometimes it's called the green gold light. And the first time that really esoteric monks got tired of cheap wine and decided that they're going to treat this cheap wine even further and distill it, made the world's first liqueur in France about 1,000 years ago, and they called it chartreuse. It has that color of green, but with intensity, like really packed in together. It's about 120 proof. So that if you take a sip of chartreuse, they still make it after 1,000 years. It is rather startling because it's like having concentrated tree sap that startles you, and if there's anything wrong with you, it gets out of you. It says, no more, we're not sticking around. Later on, because the Germans didn't want to be outdone by the French, the Germans made a distilled mixture of 16 different herbal juices, and they put together and called it Jägermeister, which will heal anything. It will even cure the blues. The distillation is a second transform. The first transform is the water into wine, which is a fermentation. The second is a distillation of taking the wine and making it into a cognac. Science is the cognac of art. Science is due to a second transform. Art is the wine. But we will see that science is the cognac. It is extraordinary to see that science and art have a distinct harmonic relationality. And just as science is the liqueur of the wine of art, the cosmos is the distillation of our spiritual persons all together in an enormous amphitheatrical community that is unnumbered through star systems without end. It does no good to go pseudo Joseph Campbell and say, oh, well, it's the force. That it binds everything together. It doesn't bind anything together. It scintillates in an infinite kinesis. So that one not only has that one can scuff clouds from a work of art, that one could be an infinite mist of intergalactic pre-hydrogen gas that slowly comes in and after a couple of billion years will make a new star system and will come out. The quality of the Johnson's wax building is such that its center has these huge lily pad columns that hold up a series of translucent ceilings, and the offices are arranged along the open amphitheater of the interior space and then branch out from there, so that one gets the sense that one is working within a massive artistic ledge work where the activity is modulated not by the freneticness of trying to just get the business done and the paperwork done, but that there's an interrelational flow going on between everyone who's in there and everyone who is kinetically brought together in that way. And as Herbert Johnson said to Wright, the only thing wrong with the building is no one wants to go home. The beginnings of this deep transform of art, Frank Lloyd Wright's expansion of Hiroshige's distillation, of Sesshu's fermentation, going back to the ancient Chinese landscape tradition. 1,000 years ago, one of the most profound of all the artists of the time was named Guo Xi. And Guo Xi has left us a beautiful essay on landscape painting. It's not very long. He says this in translation in part. Stones are the bones of heaven and earth. Bones are valuable when they are buried deep and do not appear on the surface. Water is the blood of heaven and earth. Blood is valuable when it circulates and not when it congeals. Mountains with no mist and clouds are like springtime with no flowers and grass. Mountains without clouds are not fair, without water not charming, without paths inactive, without trees and forest lifeless, and without depth they seem shallow. Without an extension of space before them they seem too close, and without height they seem too low. And so you see that the expansiveness is not only jewel-like in that it's scintillating and has facets that reveal that each facet has facets. It is like a fractal that instead of opening up into a repetition, opens up into a uniqueness, and each time the uniqueness becomes more unique. And so works of art, like spiritual persons, are indefinitely captivating. It's not that they have an awareness quality that is charismatic, but that they embody a kinesis which is spiritual and works in this way. Our education, our learning, is a development and expansion of the way in which learning has happened previously, especially the last 6,000 years in civilization. the quality that always eventually self-sabotaged our maturity as persons, our communities as viable, life-nourishing and sustaining forms, the ability to have a civilization at all that is consonant with nature and experience and consciousness and history, has been that history has been left out. Because there were never enough spirit persons to generate the real expanded kinesis of history, of historical consciousness. There's always been just a few people. And that few are even fewer than the few who have been conscious. And so we have been left in the dustbin of mind's mentality trying to figure out all of the answers and all of the angles without going into the transforms that make the resonance real and alive. And so if you go to any kind of learning, whether it's in schools or organizations, anywhere on the planet, everywhere on the planet, if you have ears to hear and eyes to see, if you have a consciousness which has been raised to historical consciousness, you look through what they have done as if it is so much finger painting. It doesn't have an art, and it doesn't produce anything except the 2005 that we have planet-wide. It's not that it is confused, it's that it's not real. And only in certain moments, in certain persons, in certain communities, are there flashes of possibility. And when they are there, they're revelatory. When we are able to look into another person's eyes personally, we understand that that life is a love relationality that is not grabbing, it's not commandeering, it's not domineering, it's not to hold. But like the scintillation of a jewel, it's meant to radiate and shine and give that gloriousness. The life movement is really an amphitheatrical kinesis, and it's important for that. In the poem, it's called The Idea of Order at Key West at the end of the Florida Keys, and Wallace Stevens is looking out to see how is it that all of a sudden he's there with a friend and they're looking out, and as they're looking out on this bay up a little ways at Key West, he realizes that he and his friend are sharing an art spirit appreciation of what it is that they're seeing, and that the sea has changed. And what changed for them all of a sudden was the fact that there was a woman walking alone on the beach down below, and she was singing. And at first they thought that she was singing to herself because she was alone. And Stevens, in the poem, as it develops, and I'll bring it next week, suddenly realizes that she is singing to the sea. And he says in the poem, the sea, whatever self it had, became the self that was her song, and she, singing, made. That the entire ocean had become the resonant embodiment of her spirit person singing to it. And he turns to his friend, whose name was Ramon Fernandez, and he says, Ramon, if you can tell me how to say it. One of the world's greatest poets had a moment where he just didn't know how you say this. He said, tell me if you know. Why, as she walks along the shore, and the waves He says the water-walled depth, the meaningless plungings of the waves through billions of years, all of a sudden have the sound of a music. And that being able to hear that music and having one's kinesis now present in that way, and the sun was going down, and as the sun was going down, he says the night tilted in the air, emptying out the day, and all the lights came on the fishing boats along their lines and the center poles, and the bay all of a sudden was an emblazoned zone of the wild geometries of the fishing boats and their night lights just coming on. And he says, he had the poem that this is beyond an idea of order that we beheld at Key West. And art is like that. It is not an idea of it, but as the beholding of an amphitheatrical presence that expands itself in that kinesis. And out of it, the radiance of the personal becomes spiritual. That the spirit is, in fact, extraordinarily real. Before we end for the day, I want to go back, circle back, because we're always going back and catching up a loop. One of the mysterious origins of landscape painting in China is that it didn't really originate in the cities. It didn't originate in the courts. People like Kukai Chi were extraordinary. He was a magician. He used to do big magic, and to cover himself, he played like he was part fool. And so he was called one of the most mysterious figures of all time. He was part fool, he was part sage, but he was all artist. And so everyone left him alone. It was an age where people were killing each other off by plots that made the Italian Renaissance look like a PTA meeting. Every 2 or 3 years, there's somebody new in power, and one time, to prove that he was a fool, one of the most powerful warlords of the time said, Kukai Chi, here's a special leaf from a tree that will make you invisible if you will hold it up. The cicadas use it to be invisible when they sing their song. And so Kukai Chi held it up, and then this warlord urinated on him. And Kukai Chi just kept it up, pretending that he was invisible, and of course couldn't be seen and couldn't see. His life was spared, and almost everyone that he knew was killed off during his lifetime. He survived. But it wasn't in such court intrigues or in the cities that Chinese landscape tradition gained its amperage in the Gobi Desert oases. The oases that dotted across the Gobi Desert all the way back to India. And if one looks to see the origins of Chinese landscape painting, you have to go back to India. And the place in India that has it most profoundly is a series of caves called Ajanta. And it's in the caves in India and Ajanta that one sees the origins of the great landscape art. And there it is in cave after cave after cave. The Indian artists around 500, 600 AD, right at the beginnings where the first tantras were being developed, you find the origins of this kind of art and vitality. And in the Chinese caves, there are about 300 of them, in an oasis that has survived the last 1,000 years called Dunhuang. One finds these kinds of landscapes painted about 1,400 years ago. And you see the beginnings of what you can still recognize in Sesshu and Hiroshige and in Frank Lloyd Wright. And when one looks at the gorgeousness of the figures in the caves at Dunhuang, you see that the angels do not fly there. The angels float in such a way that their garments are like long ribbons and streamers going against gravity, curling around them like the petals of wild sea anemones in an ocean of awareness, turned into the wine of realization, distilled into the cognac of this fabulous new kinesis. And many of them are not preaching or praying or meditating, but they're playing instruments of music. They are singing. They are singing to that vast ocean of reality that now is the amphitheater of themselves. And they live there. More next week.